So welcome to the September live event of our DEI Leader Network. My name is Rachel Gomez-Peterson. My pronouns are she, her. I'm wearing a green shirt, short sleeve. I have shoulder-length brown hair, olive complexion, and I wear glasses. Before we begin, I would like to share the land on which I am zooming in from in New York on Long Island. It is part of the ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Korchog and the Shinnecock peoples, who have and continue to live on these lands for over 10,000 years. I pay respect to the Korchog and the Shinnecock peoples past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout the Korchog and Shinnecock diaspora. As I work to create a more equitable world, I lament the injustice of our nation's history, and I commit to working towards the liberation of all peoples. Justice begins with recognition and acknowledgement. Today, we are so fortunate to have pay equity expert Keni Dominguez with us, who will walk us through strategies for equitable compensation. But before we begin, just a few administrative notes. Because of the number of people with us today, we've muted everyone. However, we welcome questions and at any time during the presentation. My colleagues, Holly Wittenberg, Elizabeth Kerwin, and Denise Roseman will be monitoring the chat as we go. So we've also saved time for discussion at the end. Next slide, please. So since we have new participants on this month's webinar, we welcome you. Thank you. I wanted to introduce you quickly to Diversity Works. We are a woman-owned firm that evaluates organizations' DEI performance using a rigorous, data-driven approach. We believe that effective DEI strategies are grounded in business drivers and that there are many ways organizations can demonstrate their commitment to DEI. Diversity Works created the DEI Leader Network to provide a platform for the DEI professional. We found that the role of the DEI professional can be a lonely one in many, if not most, organizations. Unless you're lucky enough to be part of a team, DEI leaders often shoulder the enormous amount of responsibility on a complex topic all on their own. Next slide, please. So what is the DEI Leader Network? It is the DLN, a LinkedIn group, is intended to give informal and formal DEI leaders a community to lean on and learn from. As part of the DLN, we hold monthly live events featuring subject matter experts like Keni, who is joining us today, for those assigned the responsibility for or who have an interest in diversity, equity, inclusion. Please invite others to join us every third Thursday of the month. At Diversity Works, we believe that a focus on diversity and inclusion is the right thing to do, the smart thing to do, and more relevant than ever. Given today's presentation and what we will learn, you'll see more. Next slide, please. Next slide. So Diversity Works created a diagnostic framework that we use with clients to help organizations strategically embed DEI into their operations and assess the effectiveness of their DEI initiatives. We believe that organizations can be more productive, innovative, and resilient by adopting a strategic approach to diversity, equity, inclusion. Today's topic, strategies for equitable compensation, fits really nicely into our framework. If you take a look at the slide in front of you, the blue boxes are where equitable compensation, the touch points of equitable compensation with vision and values, culture and climate, compensation and benefits, workplace policies and procedures, employee engagement and wellness, and marketing and public relations. Next slide, please. So Monday was International Equal Pay Day, and looking at the headlines of major news and business publications from the past few weeks, you can't really open a newspaper or turn on the news without a story exploring pay equity or compensation issues in organizations. As a result, crafting a clear strategy to ensure equitable compensation for all employees is incredibly relevant today. Diversity Works grounds its work in data and research. To help set the context for today's talk, managing partner Holly Wittenberg, our resident numbers nerd, is here to walk us through some data. Holly, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. So we want to just highlight a couple numbers. Keni, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Uh, this one really showcases the the issue of the gender wage gap when you factor in not only obviously gender, but race. And so what you can see is that the smallest gap is between Asian women and white men, and the largest gap is between Hispanic uh, women and white men. That's all to say that, when we think about these issues and we think about gender, we also need to apply other lenses to understand. In this case, we're talking about gender, but the fact of the matter is that people living with disabilities also face gaps as well. This is really where we strive to differentiate ourselves in terms of our DEI practice, is to bring data to the discussion and to showcase the reality of the situation and not have it be anecdotal. Next slide, please. This report from the Pew Research Center, which, by the way, is an excellent source for analysis, but also survey data, highly recommend you subscribe to their DEI-related information. It looks like a complicated slide, but I want to orient you just to this top line here. And what this says is that there was a very small gap. So women between the ages of 25 and 34 in 2010 earn 92% of their male counterparts, right? But by the time they got to the age range of 36 to 46, we see that drop. And there's a number of factors associated with that. It can be, what they call the mom tax, right? So stepping out of the workforce to have a child. It can be other caregiving responsibilities, which typically fall on women and not on men. It can be unexplained reasons that could just be related to gender bias. But this is a pretty significant drop, as you can see. And these other lines just showcase different time periods for the same analysis. And again, the issue is complicated, but it's real. So we want to make sure that women are given opportunities to advance in an organization, that when possible, flexible work arrangements are involved. When we launched Diversity Works in 2018, I interviewed a CEO that I used to work for, and I think he'd be okay with me saying it was Frank Williams. And he had been CEO at the advisory board, and he has since gone on and serves on the boards of many organizations. And he said that initially he thought that it was a woman's choice and he wasn't really worried. He knew women weren't advancing. This is 20 years ago, to give him some credit here. And he said, he didn't realize it was a systemic issue. And so he decided he was going to focus on the result he wanted, which was equal representation of women at the most senior level, and figure out a strategy to get there rather than to let it happen without his intervention. So I think that leads us nicely into introducing Keni into this discussion. Let's go to one more slide and we'll just quickly talk about the last thing in the news, which is CEO pay. This is complicated, right? The CEO is one individual, pay is one dollar amount. Whereas when you look at all the employees in the organization that are looking for increases, that's obviously a large number of people in a complex prospect. But there is increased scrutiny in the difference between CEO pay and frontline workers. I remember growing up always hearing about Ben and Jerry saying that when they started the company, they said they never wanted to make, more than 10 times what the lowest employee was making. Now they made their money other ways through equity. But look at these numbers. You've got the Ford CEO earning 281 times the average Ford employee, 365 times and 362 times. And I would argue what I read yesterday was that the argument is, if employees aren't productive, the company can't afford to give them a raise. And I would flip that and say, if the employees aren't productive, why is the CEO not being penalized for their lack of productivity? Are they not creating a culture that supports employees? Are they not allowing them to be creative? Is it not an inclusive culture? So just always push back when you hear about these notions that somehow this all should fall, the responsibility should all fall on the employee. And that, only the stakeholders should be counted for that. So with that, I will wrap up my number nerd session and a label I wear proudly. I introduce Keni. I have the great fortune of being on the board of Workplace Fairness, a nonprofit that provides employees with information about their rights with Keni. And that's how we met. And we got to know each other and decided to collaborate on this. So first of all, I'd just like to thank her for contributing to the DEI Leader Network and being a friend to our organization. She's a master at compensation strategies, and we hope you reach out to her if you have needs in that area. Keni stands as a steadfast advocate for empowerment and equity in today's dynamic professional environment. With over 10 years of leadership in people operations and human resources, she has consistently focused on creative, inclusive, and fair workplace cultures, working with notable organizations such as Accenture, Dell, and GitHub. Educated at UC Hastings College of Law, Keni earned a master's degree in work law and social justice. This specialized study laid the groundwork for her nuanced understanding of inequity, insecurity, and discrimination within the workplace. Again, thank you, Keni, for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you and Rachel for the remainder of the session.
Thank you, Holly. I appreciate such a warm and welcoming introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I hope everyone's having a great afternoon. My name is Keni Dominguez, and I am very excited to be here with you all today to discuss a topic that's really critical for all of us in each of our respective organizations, which is pay equity. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. Before we begin, I want to start by just giving a shout out and extending gratitude to both, I'll start first with the Diversity Works team. You are just incredible people. Thank you so much for inviting me to present on this topic. And I want to give an extra special shout out to Rachel and Holly. Say thank you for everything that you've done. So today we're going to be diving into pay equity, right? And we're going to wrap our hands around what does it mean to craft a fair and equitable compensation structure? How do we roll out those plans? What are some of the best practices that we need to employ? This is really important, and it's a topic that's near and dear to me, specifically because this is more than just a topic of conversation. It's what we're seeing here is an essential shift and focus for businesses globally. So this is not something that is just US centered. There is a call across the globe for pay equity. So we'll explore different aspects of what it means to craft a fair and equitable compensation plan, key principles and guidelines that you'll want to know and understand, and you'll walk away with some actionable insights that you can take back to your organizations and leaders so that you can make pay equity a reality. The landscape of equity, diversity, and inclusion in our corporate environments, as well as different organizations across various industries, we know that is rapidly changing. Fair compensation, equitable compensation is something that is absolutely a necessity. You can't afford as a leader to leave this as a topic that's on the back burner or to hope that it'll just magically clear itself up and you'll make sure that you're compensating people in a way that is fair and also competitive in the market. It's also really important to understand that it's not just about paychecks. What this is really also about is creating an environment where you have employees that feel valued, that they feel seen and recognized for their contributions in the workplace and within their organizations, that they have access to opportunities, and that they have the ability, the resources, the tools to be able to thrive. And we know firsthand that when employees can thrive, organizations thrive. So I want to explore that a bit as we get into the pay equity landscape. Before we dive in, I want to make sure that we can familiarize ourselves with the landscape so we can understand, or at least begin to understand, what are some of the challenges and opportunities here. So I want to start first with thinking about what does it mean to have pay equity present in the workplace. We all have heard the word, we've heard the phrase, but do we all really understand what it means? And so I want to break this down quite simply for everyone. Pay equity, plainly spoken, just means that there's equal pay for work of equal or comparable value, right? So to put it another way, pay should be free from discrimination based on protected characteristics. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. What we know, and we can tell here, if you take a look at this slide, we know that there's an unfortunate reality is that the pay gap is based on gender along with other factors, including race, ethnicity, and other protected characteristics. We can see here that globally, women make only 77 cents to every dollar that men make, right? And we also know, and Holly alluded to this earlier, that the pay gap widens when we apply an intersectional lens. And we'll touch on that in a bit. But with that said, sometimes, I know many of us have heard this, we tend to use the words pay equity and pay equality interchangeably. And it's really important that we understand here what is the difference, because we need to understand those concepts so that we can recognize and also to solve equity gaps when they surface in our organizations. And so that we'll be able to effectively tackle them when we see pay disparity issues that come up. So what's the difference between pay equity and pay equality? Pay equity in practice, it just means that you pay employees who are doing similar job functions comparably similar wages. You're basing the pay on the role. You're not basing it on the person. And pay equality is primarily focusing on equal access to opportunity. And so I want to just make that, I want to make sure that we all understand the differences there and what it means. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But as we talk about pay equity, I want us to think about, are there times when a pay difference for similar job functions may be justifiable? Okay. And that's also why we perform pay equity audits and why we should be assessing our salaries and compensation structure, because the answer to that question is yes. There are times where there might be a reason why someone in a similar job, similar function, might have a different pay rate. And some of those reasons can be contributed to things like tenure. Maybe they've been in that position longer, or maybe they have perhaps a special skill or additional certifications or experience that warrant additional compensation. Another key one is location, right? As we look at different types of compensation structures and philosophies, some companies have decided that they're going to pay based on the location. So you might have an engineer in San Francisco who's making more than an engineer in St. Louis. So these are some quick examples of how you might expect to see some differences in pay that could be justifiable. When we talk about pay equity, often it's in the framework of looking at it from a legal perspective. And while that's important, especially as we think through compliance, it's more than just a legal or an ethical stance, okay? It should be the cornerstone of any organization that values its workforce, okay? And the reason behind that, aside from it's the right thing to do, it's good for business, but it's also centering the employee in the experience. But it helps to foster trust between the employee and the employer, right? And we need more of that in our workplaces from what we've seen, right? We've seen enough headlines to understand that. It also drives engagement and morale, and it also helps with building brand reputation. So I want to turn our attention to some of the key factors that I have found to be some of the benefits and also highlights the significance of pay equity. So first and foremost, when we talk about employee morale and engagement, we know that ensuring equitable compensation helps create a sense of value and belonging among employees. And what that does in turns is help them to be more dedicated, to feel committed to the role or the work that they're doing, and also to be motivated to do their best work. Next, if we look at talking about reputation and employer branding, we know how important, especially in this digital age, we know that social media can reign supreme. Your reputation, your employer brand is really important, and it can be impacted by, what your commitment looks like to pay equity. Are you doing the things that you say that you will do? We know that when you adopt fair compensation practices, not only will it enhance the image of the organization, but it also helps make you stand apart from the crowd and become an employer of choice. We've talked a little bit about legal compliance. We'll dive into that a bit more later, but there's also the legal compliance risks, right? Beyond this being a moral imperative or being the right thing to do, we know that pay equity is legally mandated in many jurisdictions, and that noncompliance can lead to financial penalties, reputational damage, loss of employees, or just some of the things that can happen if we're not adhering to some of these legal guidelines. Talent acquisition and retention is another essential aspect of it. We know that when we have fair and equitable pay that's also competitive, we know that we can attract and retain top talent. And we also know that when people are paid fairly, and they know that they're paid fairly, there's awareness of that, they will stay longer and they are dedicated to the mission and to working with the organization. And last but not least, EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion. Pay equity, again, is the cornerstone of these principles. Pay equity should be essentially a core part of your EDI or a DEI strategy. If it's not, you need to, after this webinar, you need to make sure that you put that at the forefront. We need to make sure that every individual, regardless of their background, that they feel valued and that they're fairly compensated. So we need to understand and take away from this that pay equity is not just another buzzword. It is the bedrock of any thriving, inclusive, and forward-thinking organization. So I want to dive into some actual real-world data that I believe underscores the power of pay equity and transparency in an organization. So there's a notable study that was conducted from Indeed, and there were some intriguing findings from this. So what they found is that there was an overwhelming number of workers, 81%, who reported heightened productivity and engagement when they believe that they're receiving fair compensation. But there's more to this story. So the same report found that there was a significant number of job seekers, 75%, who were more inclined to apply for a position if the company was known for its transparent practices. The same could be said for if you take a look at some of the pay transparency laws that have been rolled out, right? Where you have to, let's say, for example, in New York or California, where you are required as an employer to put your salary range. The great thing about some of these laws that have been rolled out around pay transparency is that it's having a domino effect where other states or other companies, even though they're not required based on the state that they're in or they don't have employees in that state, are sharing the salary ranges, and they're also being more transparent about their wages and how their compensation is structured. And that's helping candidates or potential candidates understand if that role is aligned for them or if it's a potentially a good match. And it's saving time for both the employer and also the potential candidate to know if this is really a job or position that they want to take the time to apply for. So transparency is helpful to everybody involved. I think these numbers don't just speak, they resonate. It highlights what are some of the very real, tangible benefits that come about when organizations prioritize pay equity and transparency. So it's not just about doing what's right. It's about creating a workplace that attracts, retains, and motivates the best talent. So as we talk about pay equity, it's really important that we pay careful attention to some of the barriers that come about related to pay equity. Okay. And by all means, no means is it an exhaustive list. There are many other things that can be attributed to barriers related to pay equity. But here's a good list to start with in terms of what are some of the issues that we see come up quite often in regard to pay equity. So one is unconscious bias. And as we go through some of these, you'll see that unconscious bias can actually filter into many of these different areas, especially things like career progression or negotiation disparities. If we're looking at unconscious bias or even conscious bias, a great example of that would be when we have hiring managers who favor candidates from specific universities or backgrounds, or there are certain companies that they only want to hire from. That is a great example, or a series of great examples of how we can see barriers come about because of or related to unconscious bias. When we look at, I've worked with a lot of clients in compensation, and one of the things that I see come up often is either having outdated data or not having standardized compensation structures. And what I mean by that is They've never ran a salary benchmarking exercise. They're going to Glassdoor, they're going to Indeed. They're doing their best, or what they think is the right thing to do in terms of trying to put together a salary range. But it's outdated, or it's not accurate. It's not reflective of what is the current market. And so it's really important that, you're as an organization or as a leader, that you're effectively prioritizing doing things like salary benchmarking on an annual basis, and making sure that you're not just pulling data, but you're pulling data that's accurate from the right places based on your industry type. Another key piece here is lack of transparency, which is, we'll go back and talk a little bit more about pay transparency laws, but lack of transparency, we know, is another significant barrier, which is also essentially what helped bring about some of the legislation changes that we're seeing right now. We know, and I think we've all experienced this in organizations that maybe we have been a part of, that without clear communication about how pay decisions, or really any decisions, are made, misconceptions tend to arise. I always tell my clients, because compensation is a challenging topic for a lot of folks, and there's a desire sometimes to want to hide. And that's the exact opposite of what we should be doing. We need to make sure that we're being really clear with our employees and with our people, so that they understand, how compensation is put together. For example, if you have two colleagues in similar roles who have pay disparities, or it looks like at a face value there might be potentially pay disparities without a clear reason, it's going to create mistrust, right? We're losing opportunities, I think, in organizations to garner trust and to build solid relationships with our people, because we're just too scared to have some challenging conversations related to compensation or to do the work. Negotiation disparities are also another one that comes into play. We know that historically in the past, women had been less likely to negotiate their salaries than men, which led to some starting pay discrepancies that only continued to widen over time. But we're also seeing data that shows that women are negotiating. It's just looked at differently. And sometimes it's received in a different way than when men negotiate. It doesn't mean that women shouldn't negotiate. Everyone should always negotiate. But I'm just wanting to highlight that oftentimes when women are in the process of negotiating, it's looked at differently, and sometimes it can be looked at in a negative way. So we have to do things to combat that. And then one of my favorites, which is career progression, or what I like to refer to as access to opportunity. This is another key one. A lot of companies do not have a career progression framework or a leveling framework in place. And what happens there is then people don't know, how do they get promoted? What skills or competencies are needed to get to the next level? What do promotions look like? Those things are not clear for folks. And when they're not, it limits their access to opportunity, right? Because we know that some individuals may not have the same access to mentorship, sponsorship, training, professional development opportunities that may be available in their organization, or who gets picked for these high visibility projects, who's chosen for that, or who knows that there are potential opportunities that exist, right? So for an example of this here would be, if you had maybe a talented individual who maybe you looked at them as being more introverted, and they're coming from a different background, from a marginalized group, and you decide that they don't have what it takes to be promoted, or you're just not sure if they need just one more thing to be promoted. These are some of the things that really hold people back, and that create additional barriers for pay equity. And then the last piece that I just want to highlight is insufficient legislation or enforcement. And what I mean by that is, we have new pay transparency laws. It is taking a while for some organizations to adopt some of the guidelines, or we see people who are stretching those practices, right? You've seen the salary ranges where there's $100,000 range for a role, and that doesn't do anything to help a candidate understand where they may fit in from a salary perspective. It's in a way sort of trying to go around what the purpose is for pay transparency laws. There's also the enforcement of it. Who's going to enforce this? Who's going to catch all of the different job descriptions that don't have a salary range? And then also some of these laws are not yet comprehensive enough. So we're thinking about regions where there are no pay transparency laws, or gender pay gap reporting isn't mandatory, or where the penalties for noncompliance may be minimal. So as we think about pay equity, we often think about pay gaps, right? And we often see a lot of information floating around on the internet about the gender pay gap. And while the gender pay gap and disparities are prevalent, it's really important that we address the issue that goes much deeper, okay? And what we know is that when we apply the intersectional lens, we can see that there are pay disparities that extend beyond gender lines. We know that both men and women and non-binary individuals of historically marginalized groups receive lower pay for doing the same work. And I think we all know and understand that this needs to change. We know that in the United States, women earn 84 cents for every dollar earned by white men. And we also know that when we apply intersectionality to women's wage gap, we know that Native and Indigenous women earn 51 cents on the dollar. Latina women earn 54 cents. Pacific Islander women earn 61 cents. Black women earn 64. And white women earn 79 cents for every dollar earned by white men. And Asian women earn 80 cents. So these numbers reflect, I just want to, as a disclaimer, the national average. And so there are many states that are paying these women less. And all of the data is from the lifetime wage gap state by state, just for informational purposes. If anyone's interested, you can find that at the National Women's Law Center. So as we push for change, our lens has to be broad, and we also need to make sure that we are being inclusive and looking beyond gender when we're thinking through pay gaps. So as we navigate the terrain of pay equity, it's important that we understand what are some of the foundational principles of fair compensation. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is, from my experience, some of the key areas that we definitely want to hone in on. So one is transparency. And I want to note here, it doesn't say just pay transparency. It's transparency related to your promotional criteria, who's getting promoted, how often are they getting promoted, what are your goals for that for the following year. It's also transparency around things like, what target percentile do you pay in, or do you start people at? It's your salary ranges. It's what are the different compensation events that happen during the year? What does your performance review or performance management cycle look like? What is the criteria for that? It's just being transparent in the way that you deal with your employees. I'm not just hinting here at pay transparency. All those different elements, whether they're direct or indirect, are still related to compensation. And so it's important that there's an openness about that, and that it's clear and it's accessible to employees, because this helps us to be able to build trust as leaders. And it's about employees knowing how their compensation is also determined. Where do you get the data? How often is that data refreshed, right? They need to understand how that compensation is being determined. They need to understand the how behind it so that they can trust that that process is fair. And so what we've seen is that when companies take the time to really outline those different aspects of information and train and educate and make sure that it's accessible to their teams, it really goes a long way to improving morale, trust, engagement. People feel fairly compensated. They're going to feel valued for the work that they do and for their contributions. It's a win-win for everybody. Another piece here is equity. Whether it's compensation or any other process or foundational structure that you're trying to create within your organization, equity should be front and center. And really, it's at the heart of our discussion today. So we need to make sure that all of our employees, regardless of their identity, their gender, their race, or any other factors, that they're compensated fairly for similar roles and responsibilities. When we think about market competitiveness, okay, so we're talking about making sure that our compensation package, our full compensation package, not just base, are fair internally, but also that they're competitive externally. And the way that we do that is by running salary benchmarking exercises. It's by making sure that we have access to that data to stay relevant. And that's what's going to help you to attract and retain the best talent in your respective industry. When we look at consistency and standardization, that is really about having a uniform and consistent approach to how you develop and define your compensation strategy. You want to make sure that your compensation plan isn't arbitrary and that it's based on predefined, understandable criteria. And then we look at holistic approach. That's just reminding us about compensation isn't just about salary. That encompasses benefits, L&D opportunities, work-life balance, flexible time off, PTO. It's the complete package. And so we need to be assessing that as we're looking at fair compensation. And lastly, I just want to touch on the importance and the value of ongoing review and adjustment. We know that the market is always changing and evolving. Roles change, industries evolve, and therefore our compensation structures have to adapt. And so we know that with regular reviews, that helps us to stay aligned with the market, but also make sure that we're staying in alignment with how we've designed internal equity within our organizations, so that we can make sure that that's also aligned with our goals around fairness, and also that we can make sure we're staying competitive. When we have all of these different principles together and factored in, that helps us lay the foundational work for fair compensation. And it helps us to make sure that our organizations are thriving on trust, equity, and excellence. So I want to shift your attention to a quote that I think is really useful for this particular topic. And I think it encapsulates the essence of the discussion, which is, through transparency, organizations can cultivate trust. Open and clear compensation practices are critical to addressing both the racial and gender pay inequities. And to underscore the importance, I want you to consider this. There was a study from Monster that indicated that there was a staggering 98% of workers who favor salary disclosures. And it's clear because employees want to understand their compensation. Again, it just goes back to people want to know what they can expect. It also gets, that initial fear or anxiety for people out of the way in terms of having to talk to a recruiter on that initial interview about what the range is and having to do a little bit of back and forth on that. It makes it very clear for everyone. Demystifying pay structures, by making compensation understandable, we remove barriers, and then we have to promote the open dialogue that's needed. When we have the clear criteria, again, trust and understanding is what we're promoting. And when employees know the why behind their pay, they feel valued, and it creates strong workplace relationships. What we're trying to do here with transparent pay practices is eliminate shadows of doubt. That's what we're doing here. Because in the absence of information, doubt and suspicion will flourish. Transparent pay practices help make sure that these shadows are eliminated. What I mean by that is, if you are in a position in an organization where you have leadership who are tentative, are nervous about having open discussions around compensation, or they're hiding information around compensation and promotions because maybe they don't feel like they have all the pieces that they need together, it's really important that you start trying to put those items and elements together so that you can have effective conversations with your people, because they need to know and understand this. Because in the absence of information, people will fill in the gaps. And sometimes that's with accurate information, but a lot of the times it's with information that's not accurate, or they don't have the full context. So we need to make sure that we're illuminating that for folks. Understanding equity in the workplace, again, this just needs to be front and center of any process or structure that you're trying to implement in your organization. It's also important to understand that equity in the workplace isn't just about treating everyone the same. That's equality. We're talking about recognizing and addressing the unique challenges and barriers that are faced by different employees. So it's essentially a commitment that you're creating an environment where everyone has an equal opportunity or shot at success based on their individual needs and circumstances. When we are talking about this next piece, which is what sort of, I think, makes folks nervous, which is the benchmarking, market competitiveness, and internal equity. I want to spend some time on this particular area. When we look at benchmarking, this is our compass, okay? It's the way that we can compare our pay practices from different organizations with industry norms and those of our competitors. That's how we stay aligned and informed. But when we're going to start a benchmarking exercise, one of the things that we really need to make sure that we're focusing on is that we are benchmarking roles and that we're not benchmarking titles, because often in organizations, the titles serve as a default for a level. And so what I always have clients do, or I recommend, is that when you're starting a salary benchmarking exercise, if you don't already have a leveling framework in place or a career progression framework that clearly shows the different levels that you can advance to in your organization and what those competencies are for each respective level, it's going to be difficult to make sure that you're benchmarking your roles accurately, because you want to make sure that you're benchmarking apples to apples and not apples to oranges. So that's actually something that we want to do in tandem when we are starting the benchmarking exercise, and making sure that we have up-to-date data and accurate information around our employee census, so that we can pull in information like their tenure, that we can pull in their role, their job family. We can pull in their respective level in the organization. We can also look at if they've been promoted within that year and how many times. We also need to be looking at things outside of base pay. We need to also be looking at performance bonuses. That can make a huge difference in pay for some folks, depending on what organization you're in. So we need to be looking at all of those different areas when we're benchmarking, and making sure that we have the right data for the type of industry that we're in, and that we're comparing ourselves against similar organizations and not trying to compare ourselves to organizations that really don't fit our model, because otherwise you can end up with really inaccurate data. And then also market competitiveness. That helps you to understand through the exercise of salary benchmarking, how competitive are you within the market? Are you at market, which typically can be seen as, being at the 50th percentile? Are you leading the market? Are you above that? Or are you lagging the market below 50th percentile? So it gives you an idea of where you are. And often what you may see is that depending on, what you might have some areas of your organization where you're right at market, and you might find through the exercise that you have some that are right under. And so you may need to do some salary adjustments to reflect those changes. And then last but not least, internal equity. So we need to make sure that we're not just evaluating the market, but looking internally to see, how are people being paid across different levels? How are they being paid across different genders? And looking at the intersectionality of those areas as well. Taking it back to consistency and standardization. So again, as you're going through and looking at how you're going to create your compensation structure, you want to make sure that it is uniform, that you have a foundation that is clearly documented, that clearly outlines what is your philosophy on compensation and how that's gathered. Standardization needs to be your roadmap. It needs to be a clear, structured framework, so that it can bring clarity to your compensation decisions. And it also needs to, really the three words that come to mind for me is predictability, transparency, and equity, right? So your team needs to understand the how and why, so it's not a mystery. Transparency, the standardized practices, so that you can articulate and justify your compensation decisions. And it's also about open communication. And above all, with equity, making sure that you have a consistent and standardized approach. When we look at the holistic comp view, that's beyond the base salary. We want to also look at the different value of our benefits, as well as understanding the significance of how well-being is factored into compensation as well. Are you paying your people enough to where they have money to live their life, right? Is there a balance between their career and their personal well-being? So we want to make sure that we're looking at those things as well. Fair compensation is really comprehensive in nature. And so we just need to make sure that when we are either, benchmarking or looking at designing compensation structures, that we are going beyond just what we see typically on a paycheck. And then in terms of ongoing review, we need to make sure that as we're doing adjustments and reviews, that these aren't just things that we're skipping over or we're not staying on a set schedule. It's really the lifeblood of fair compensation. And we really need to make sure that our compensation is not static. We need to be evaluating this on an annual basis. We need to make sure that as there are market changes or inflation, how does that change the dollar for our employees and for our staff? We need to make sure that we're preserving the value and the purchasing power of what our employees can earn. I also want to make it clear that transformation in relation to creating a fair and equitable compensation structure or plan, these things don't happen overnight. There are a lot of different things that need to be done in order for you to make equity a reality in your compensation. It's going to take a concerted effort, and it's definitely going to require a systematic approach. So some of these things you're going to have to, kind of take one by one and take a step-by-step approach to get this off the ground. So I want to help you all with some actionable insights that can serve as a roadmap for your organization. So number one of the things that I think is really helpful when you're trying to build a compensation structure and maintain it is to establish an equity committee or a compensation committee. And what you do is you begin by forming a dedicated team with different diverse perspectives, so different levels and roles, to help oversee and advise and monitor different pay equity initiatives. The second piece of that is regular salary benchmarking and pay equity audits. This is really essential so that you understand where you're in the market. The pay equity audits, it's going to help you catch discrepancies before they become entrenched. Often what I will do with salary benchmarking is I go ahead, since I'm already looking at compensation, and I will run a pay equity audit, right? One of the key missing elements to the pay equity audit, and I would advise you all, if you don't have access to this information now, to make sure you start thinking about how you can gather this information internally, is you need to understand your employee demographics. You really can't perform a pay equity audit if you don't know the different background of folks in your organization. So if you don't know like their race or gender identity, if you don't know, different sensitive information, you can collect it one of two ways. I prefer a survey. It's done on a voluntary basis, that folks can just fill out that information as needed. It really helps to get that information into your system so that it's set up for the pay equity audit. So make sure if that's something that you'd like to do to close out the year, that you start gathering that information now. The other piece is creating just a clear compensation philosophy, which is going to serve as your organization's compass. And to be clear, what should be a part of your compensation philosophy, I always tell everyone to start with guidelines. Use that as your North Star. So look at your organizational values, because that should be embedded into your compensation philosophy. Start there before you start looking at what are the other areas or aspects that you need to have be a part of that. And then also start thinking about, where are you going to get this data? How often are you going to refresh it? Where are you targeting in the market? How is your compensation structured? How are compensation decisions made? How are those decisions communicated? It's also really useful to have exception criteria in your compensation philosophy. So if there are times during the year where there might be someone who's outside of a performance review cycle who needs to be promoted, how do you handle that? Making sure that you answer all those questions within the philosophy itself, and also providing an accompanying FAQ guide is also really helpful for employees, and just making sure that it's accessible. And then also making sure that you are adopting data-driven decision-making. If you can, get that data out of a Google Sheet or Excel sheet and use a compensation platform so that you can store that information. It'll make it much easier for you when you're trying to pinpoint discrepancies, or if you're trying to make adjustments with precision. And then also the career progression framework. There are many templates available online. You don't have to start from scratch to build career progression template. In fact, I will leave my contact information if anyone's interested in some samples or examples. I'm happy to provide those to anyone. It's really useful because having a career progression framework and guide and providing that to your staff, that allows them to understand from a very transparent perspective how they can expect to move up within the organization and what are some of the pathways that are available for them. And also including in those career progression guides your salary bands for the different levels. It's really helpful. It's accessible to the employees, aside from whatever salary ranges that you're posting for jobs. And then lastly, just creating effective training offerings for managers and for employees. It's just as important for employees to understand how compensation works as it is for their managers. Okay. And last but not least, when in doubt or when you're feeling overwhelmed with compensation, it may be a good idea, and actually often it is, or a good practice to collaborate with external consultants. And the reason behind that, some of the benefits that you get from it is expertise and access to data, tools, and resources that you may not have available within your organization. When you work with a consultant, they have experience across different industries. They can bring some really valuable insights. They're also coming in from the outside, so they're able to highlight where there might be gaps or biases that may be hidden from plain view from folks in the organization. And they also, again, have access to the latest tools and methods, and they can help you with benchmarking and also making sure that you're in the know and are staying up to date around legal compliance. So last but not least, my call to action for everyone is, who's attended this webinar today, if you could go back to your organizations and really try to do everything that you can to make pay equity a reality. I want you just to remember something very quickly. The way that we can start by doing that is first you have to assess your situation. So we have to look at where we are today in your organization with your compensation. Do you have a structure? Do you need one? Does it need to be revised or designed? Education, making sure that you're learning about pay equity, that you're continuing on this path. And then also engaging with experts, consultants. There's a lot of information that you can find online about pay equity that's really useful. I'm happy to drop some links and resources for folks. And then once you've started assessing and starting to identify what some of the issues are, then you have the opportunity to act. And we can implement change within our organizations by regularly monitoring and making adjustments as needed. We are going into the fourth quarter. This is an excellent time to run these exercises. You're thinking about what you're going to spend or budget for your upcoming fiscal year. This is a great time to be looking at salary benchmarking and seeing who needs to be adjusted so that you can factor that into your budget for the upcoming year. So with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone. And I also just want to save a few minutes or room if folks have time for any questions that they may have. I'll also make sure that I leave my contact info if anyone wants to reach out via email or over LinkedIn. I'm happy to answer any questions you have related to pay equity or compensation.
And we always send out an email with the link to the webinar and some information. So we'll be sure to send Keni's information in that email. So we have a couple of questions. So Alexandria is asking for additional resources. We are currently in the process of running a pay equity, so we would love that. One question that came privately in the chat: how do you address internal discrepancies when the market benchmark seems to encourage it?
Say that question one more time. You faded out at the very end.
Mm-hmm. How do you address internal discrepancies when the market benchmark seems to encourage it?
I think that can be a bit challenging. So what I always tell clients is, when you do salary benchmarking and you're looking at salary data, that looking at the market data is to help inform your decisions. It doesn't mean that is what you have to, that's how you have to set your pay exactly. I think oftentimes when people run into that challenge, they may be looking at data that's not necessarily aligned with their particular industry or revenue that they bring in. And that can also kind of throw off those numbers. And so what I would say is two things. One is you can either I would say double check to see if you're really comparing apples to apples. I think that's something that's really important, making sure that you're looking at the right industry, that you are looking at companies. And what I mean by that is it's really good if you have an opportunity to look at it by revenue or by valuation. You can also, I tend to stay away from the number of employees because that doesn't often matter. The most, I think, useful metrics is looking at what the valuation is of the company, or what is the amount of money that's been raised, or what is the revenue that they're bringing in. So I'd start there first. If the market is suggesting that it's below what's considered equitable within an organization, I think that's up to the organization to decide what makes sense for them specifically. So, for example, if you're committed to equity, then you would choose to pay above that market rate to make sure that you're ensuring fairness. But it's a balance between your internal values and then also looking at what the external market is showing. So you just have to kind of find a balance in between the two.
Well, Keni, we are out of time, but we really thank you for joining us today. And I think we'd love to carry on this conversation on our LinkedIn page and our membership group. So feel free to once we post this to that group, feel free to pose some more questions, and I'm sure we can get those answers to our members. So thank you so much for joining us. I learned so much from you. Really expanded my mind around what really equitable compensation entails, and gave me some real valuable tools to move on, and see that through with all organizations. So thank you. And there's a lot of love in the chat saying thank you so much, and interest in the career progress template. So thank you for attending, everyone. And we hope to see you at next month's. Keni, if you could just advance one slide.
Oh, yes. Sorry about that.
No worries. So next month, we are hosting another DI Leader Network live event on supplier diversity. We'll be hearing from one of our managing partners, Elizabeth Kerwin, along with a few other people who are still being confirmed as we speak. So thanks again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again next month and continue the conversation on our LinkedIn group. Thanks so much, everyone.